Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining us in our webinar series in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Richmond. I'm Patrice Rankin, Dean of the School and Professor of Classics. The conversation tonight is one of the two focal points in the title of our series, Responding to Two Pandemics. As we all begin to put our minds to the holidays and hopefully a breather from the incessant Zoom meetings, I will say that we have exciting plans for a few webinars next semester after some rest, when we will pick up our focus on race and racism. This will be first with Dr. Natasha Wariku in February. She is the author of The Diversity Bargain and Other Dilemmas of Race, Admissions, and Meritocracy at Elite Universities, and will be in conversation with our own Dr. Bedelia Richards, herself an expert whose research interrogates the role of educational institutions in reproducing institutionalized racism and classism. Dr. Liddell McWhorter, Stephanie Bennett Smith Chair in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, will be part of that conversation as well. So stay tuned for the dates in February for this webinar. We don't have the date quite yet, but we'll get you that in the new year. And then for March 31st, 2021, we have added Detroit-based artist Sabrina Nelson. If you're able to Google her and take a look at some of her work in brief videos online, you'll be as excited as I am. Arts and Sciences professors Bert Ash and Megan Driscoll will host that conversation. And we welcome Megan to our fold, and all of the other new faculty who started this year during these very strange and isolating times. The School of Arts and Sciences also wants to reiterate tonight that these conversations are part of our learning environment, and we are pleased that students, faculty, and staff have joined. Students have engaged through our undergraduate research committee stipends. Tonight, I want to congratulate students and their faculty mentors on 3 projects, each very different from the other, each responding to the pandemics and the webinar series, each a testament to the breadth and depth of arts and sciences and the liberal arts. First, Haiwan Hong has won an award for the project, The Effect of Improving Friendship Quality on Well-Being and Loneliness Amidst Global Pandemics and Experimental Intervention. Psychology professor Christian Lundberg is the faculty mentor for this project, which hypothesizes that friendship interventions may be particularly important for the Black and Asian American populations who have been more strongly affected by race-related discrimination. Secondly, Casey Morano won an award for At the Fall Line, Where Bodies Meet. Artist and professor Erling Chavold is the mentor for this project. Casey will create 2 complementary bodies of work that engage with the James River Fall Line and its surrounding metro area. She will look at indigenous traditional environmental knowledge and work at the intersection of environmental and social justice, recognizing that colonizing nature hurts both marginalized communities and the land. This is an interdisciplinary art project that deploys data and mapping, site visits, and painting. Thirdly, Berke Nuri and Jonathan Hong won an agent-based model to evaluate the effect of socioeconomic status and demographic factors on COVID-19 prevalence and mortality. Dr. Joanna Wares in Math Computer Science is mentoring this project. Berke and Jonathan will study how the prevalence and mortality of a pandemic change depending on the population's demographic factors. Congratulations to all of our students, and thank you to the faculty mentors who have worked extremely hard to elicit and develop the best in all of our students this semester and always. And these awards will be available again for application in the spring, so students look out for those as we move into the next semester. So without further ado, let me turn to introductions for tonight and then hand the event over to my colleagues. Tonight, we welcome Professor Frank Snowden, Andrew Downey Orrick Professor Emeritus of History and History of Medicine at Yale University. He is author of several books, including Naples in the Time of Cholera, 1884 to 1911, and The Conquest of Malaria, 1900 to 1962. Conquest was awarded the Gustav Ranis Prize from the Macmillan Center at Yale in 2007 as the best book on an international topic by a member of the Yale faculty. The Helen and Howard R. Moraro Prize by the American Historical Association as the best work on Italy in any period, and the 2008 Welch Medal rather, for the American Association for the History of Medicine. Epidemics and Society from the Black Death to the Present was published last year, not too long before the March 2020 COVID pandemic declarations. As a reviewer in The Guardian put it, Snowden shows that, quote, epidemic disease has shaped nations and civilizations every bit as starkly as economics or politics or war, end quote. The Wall Street Journal review of Epidemics and Society noted that, quote, as we grapple with a new pandemic, Mr. Snowden's case studies are eye-catching. He has a gift for concise exposition and lively phrases, end of quote. University of Richmond Arts and Sciences professor Elizabeth Autka will be in conversation with Professor Snowden. She is professor of English, and her latest book, Viral Modernism, The Influenza Pandemic and Interwar Literature from Columbia University Press, investigates how one of the deadliest plagues in history, the 1818-1819 influenza pandemic, silently reshaped the modernist era, infusing everything from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland to the emergence of viral zombies to the popularity of seances. For this book, she has received the 2020 Book Award in the monograph category from the South Atlantic Modern Language Association. The chair of the Prize Committee described viral modernism as providing, quote, a necessary framework to understand the remains of unresolved grief surrounding the 1918 influenza pandemic, and by default, a much needed tool to better comprehend the cultural impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic. The book could not have arrived at a more opportune time, end of quote. Professor Eugene Wu will lead question and answer. He is an associate professor in the Department of Biology. He is a teacher scholar focusing on the molecular architecture of viruses and the machines that copy DNA. He holds his Bachelor of Science degree from Harvey Mudd College. At the Scripps Research Institute, his PhD thesis focused on the identification of a receptor for a virus that causes viral pink eye. During a postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University Medical Center, his research revealed the mechanism behind the amazing accuracy of the enzymes that copy DNA. He teaches classes on viruses and molecular biology while continuing to study life at the molecular and atomic scale. I am very much looking forward to this conversation. So welcome again, all guests, and thank you, colleagues, for leading this conversation.
So thank you, Dean Rankin, and thanks to everyone out there attending. And a huge thanks to Dr. Frank Snowden for being with the UR community this evening. I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Snowden. And just a quick reminder to the audience, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Use that instead of the chat function. And we'll incorporate those questions into the latter half of the program when I'll turn things over to Dr. Eugene Wu. Let me begin with just a few frames for our discussion. Pandemics of disease inevitably raise a set of urgent questions. How do we prevent them? How do we prepare for them? And how do we respond to them once they've arrived? Most immediately, these questions seem like ones for the fields of medicine, epidemiology, public health, and the like. Yet pandemics raise enormous recurring and difficult problems that require the resources of many disciplines to address. Broadly speaking, we need the sciences intertwined with the humanities. Just as pandemics themselves are lenses that show the fault lines and strengths of the societies they hit, they likewise reflect how multifaceted the responses and solutions must be, calling for the resources of different disciplines and for interactions among them. We need a vaccine and a history of vaccines. We need medicines and aesthetic and therapeutic responses to cope with trauma and grief. We need to learn the histories of past pandemics and the ethical and religious issues they raise. We need statistics on who and where and why a virus attacks and what those numbers show us about existing and emerging inequalities. We need to assess economic impacts. We need to know about human behavior and what drives it. We need to understand how issues like deforestation link to animal behavior and the emergence of new viruses. We need, in short, the resources of a university. With COVID, we have some treatments, preventative measures, a promising set of vaccines, but these will have limited value if people don't have access to them, or if we can't figure out why large groups of people don't believe a pandemic is happening at all. The need for an interdisciplinary approach to disease pandemics dovetails with the two pillars of this year-long webinar series, the twinned pandemics of COVID-19 and racism. And tonight we'll discuss some of their interactions, looking at how pandemics of disease and their history and impacts may reveal, reproduce, and amplify systemic racism and broad patterns of inequality and discrimination. One of the many powerful elements of Dr. Snowden's latest book, Epidemics and Society, which I cannot recommend highly enough, is how he deftly weaves together these fields and issues, examining the science and the history, the arts and the ethics, the statistics and the human behavior, giving us a comprehensive analysis of pandemics and their vast but often overlooked effects. He explores how diseases intertwine with historic inequalities and scapegoating, capturing the nexus of issues pandemics raise. As he observes, quote, epidemics are not an esoteric subfield for the interested specialist, but instead are a major part of the big picture of historical change and development. Infectious diseases are as important to understanding societal development as economic crises, wars, revolutions, and demographic change. And in the book, unquote, and in the book, he considers these impacts on individuals, but also on religion, on art, on literature, on the intellectual history of medical thought, the development of public health, and much more. So taking a cue from your book, Dr. Snowden, I framed my questions for our discussion this evening as interdisciplinary. I'll ask about what we can learn from past pandemics you've studied, about some of the parallels and distinctions between COVID and these pandemics, about these deep inequalities pandemics reveal, and about how we might imagine a better path forward. So I thought we might begin with a mystery or a paradox. And pandemics are these vastly influential events on the course of societies and history. You've proven that amply in your book, and the death tolls are staggering. And yet they often don't seem to carry the same perceived weight historically as, say, a war, despite all of these impacts. And I wondered if you could start by talking about some of the reasons that you see for this discrepancy between, why are we not studying pandemics from kindergarten, given their impacts?
Right, that's a very interesting and challenging question, and thank you very much. I believe that you're absolutely right in that diseases are enormously variable and in their impact and in their origins, and that each needs to be seen in its own right and in its historical context. Some pandemics have utterly transformed the societies they affected, the plague of Athens, the bubonic plague. Others, cholera also, one might say. Others have had much more limited impact, and you can't tell which it is simply by the body count, the mortality that's created. And here I think that comparing COVID-19 and the influenza of 1918 to 19 is illustrative and illuminating. The reason is that the Spanish influenza killed one, nobody knows precisely, but an extraordinary number of people in the range of somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. And yet, the normal history, the most noted history of the Spanish influenza in the United States, calls it America's forgotten pandemic. It was also true that if you look to the way it's been memorialized in the United Kingdom, in which there are infinite memorials to the First World War and its experience, there is exactly one to memorialize the doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers who played such a heroic role in fighting this disease. Now, there are many reasons this is the case. One has to do, of course, with what was happening at the time. And that is to say that it was overshadowed in people's minds by the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution and the other Russian Revolution in 1917, by the Red Scare in the United States that followed the First World War, by the peacemaking process and the way in which a new world was being created by it. So those were contemporary factors. Another was that there was a wartime censorship among the belligerent powers. This is why it's known as the Spanish influenza, because Spain was a non-belligerent, and therefore the Spanish press was uncensored. And so people, if you wanted to know what was going on, you would read the Spanish press. And so it became known as the Spanish influenza, though in no other way was Spain actually a decisive factor. Then there was the fact that presses in the belligerent countries and the governments themselves self-censored or censored because they didn't want to give their enemies a clear picture of ways in which the disease was hampering their mobilization and their morale, and give them something that might be useful in prosecuting the war itself. So that was a major factor. People didn't fully know. Another factor was that this was influenza, and people thought, oh, everybody knows this is la grippe. It's the flu, and it's nothing so enormously threatening in lots of ways. And then I think a decisive factor is the way that the disease passed through societies. And here one can see that some of the diseases that have had such an enormous impact are ones that lay siege to a society for a prolonged period. Bubonic plague did that. And so the particular outbreak would last for months or even more. And the influenza, by contrast, passed through a society, killed, let's say, a city, and killed a large number of people because it infected so many people, but then it was gone in just a matter of weeks. And it didn't last that long in an individual's body either. And so it was possible for people to feel that they could put this behind them because it wasn't something catastrophic, traumatic it had been, but it wasn't going to last for the foreseeable protracted future. This is why COVID-19 is so radically different. It is affecting it's causing a much lesser mortality, but it's also affecting such large numbers of people, but it's with us for the long term. And it seems to affect every aspect of our society. It's enormously dealt a blow to the world economy in a way that's almost unprecedented on an international scale. It is also having a traumatic effect on people's psychology and so on. And it is, in fact, at the center of everyone's attention, as we even know from this past election, that it was the #1 issue on people's minds during the election. So it really is something that is captured everyone's imagination, and we know full well the course of the disease, its impact, the numbers. Every night we see that on the news. So these are reasons that COVID-19 plus COVID-19 is very unlikely to go away in the near future, unfortunately. And so for that reason, we have to take it into account in everything we do, how we work, our cultural life, our educational life, how we meet with our friends. Everything is affected by it. And so it's something that has its tentacles in every corner of our lives. And so that didn't happen in the Spanish influenza in the same way. So in that respect, I think this is going to be profoundly transformative in our history.
Do you know, one of the things you do in your book as you go through the different diseases is you're looking at the etiology of the disease and how that sort of impacts things, and also sometimes specifically at symptoms, at sort of, you know, the symptoms of smallpox, the symptoms of the bubonic plague, that those were things that that determined the sort of force and the direction of the impacts that the disease caused. What do you have any speculation on sort of symptoms with, well, either origins, right, sort of the cause, the way it's transmitted with COVID-19, or the or specific symptoms that will, do you think, play into the impacts that it will have?
Yes. COVID-19, I think the first thing that is causing such a profound impact is that it wasn't the flu or the common cold, although we know that that's been said to the American public, but it was something entirely new. And I think that that is it puts a person's teeth on edge, a whole society, this idea that they're being afflicted, that's something that doctors don't understand. There's no treatment, there's no cure, there's no vaccine, no understanding of its pathophysiology and its course on the body. And then the fact is that this disease, in addition to being strange, that is unknown, it's only been in human history since, as far as we know, from December 2019, less than a year. And think how it's affected all of us in a disease that a year ago, no one had ever known about. And so that's a factor. An outside invader is how it seems. And then its symptoms, as you mentioned, are important to the hold that it has on people's imagination. And this is the disease that's terrifying in many ways because of its impact on the respiratory system. And that means that people, it's gruesome, suffocating to death. And I think that is part of the horror of COVID-19. But then another feature is that there's a mysterious quality. It's mysterious because we don't understand it. And one day people will understand it. But for the moment, it seems mysterious. It's mechanisms that allow it also to affect so many other organs and bodily systems, so that after the respiratory system, it's also not just a pulmonary disease, but it can present or affect a patient as primarily a cardiovascular disease and cause heart failure and embolism and thrombosis and all of these other features, heart failure. It can affect the digestive tract. It can affect the arteries and veins of the body. It can, people now think it may also be one of those diseases that has an effect on the brain itself. And so it may be that in the wake of this disease or along with it, there is a disease of mental illness or at least post-traumatic stress disorder. And that seems to be a feature of coronaviruses in the sense that SARS also 10 years after SARS had passed through Hong Kong, studies of the patients and doctors and healthcare workers who treated patients there tell us that many of them are having sleep disorders and anxiety, and they're under psychiatric care for depression. So one can imagine that this disease will also have, in its wake, will leave a devastated mental landscape for many people, both for the social isolation and loneliness, and then perhaps for physical effects on the human brain, which are not yet well understood. So it's this multifaceted, profound way that it affects individuals that's also quite disturbing and will be part of society's reaction to it.
Yeah, I found that this thesis that you have of these sort of these symptoms kind of having these broad implications in terms of the way that it sort of functions in the imagination. I found that to be true for the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. That kind of dramatic symptoms that it produced ended up sort of infusing into the literature in the way that that literature is sort of great at capturing a kind of emotional climate and a physical climate, and the intertwined qualities of these mental, sort of lingering mental effects and the lingering physical effects that are hard to kind of localize. Now, you saw some repeating patterns across all of these pandemics. And one of the questions I had for you is, I know lots of people were surprised by the emergence and the spread of COVID, and you and I are in this weird group of people who published books on pandemics, right, as one was emerging. And you've been hearing things like prescient and uncanny timing, but I want to know, like, were you surprised by COVID, or were you just feeling affinities with Cassandra?
I have to say that I was not surprised by the coming of COVID-19, and it's a tragedy that had long been foretold. I'm not making a claim to special prescience, that from 1997 and the avian flu until COVID was upon us, there had been yellow lights continually flashing from virologists and public health officials. And Anthony Fauci went to the US Senate in 2005, along with Dr. Gerberding, the director of the CDC at the time. And they made an analogy saying that meteorologists could tell someone who lived in the Caribbean that there was going to be a hurricane in their future. They couldn't pinpoint the date or the strength of the winds, but they could say that if the person didn't take that into account and didn't prepare, that would be very unwise. Virologists, they said, are in the same position. They could say that there will be a major pandemic challenge, perhaps as great as that of the Spanish influenza, maybe even more so, that it's most likely to be a pulmonary disease. They can't say the date or exactly how deadly it will be, but it's incumbent upon us as a society to prepare, and it would be very unwise not to. And then we see that in Britain as well, there was a commission that discovered that there was a growing vulnerability to a disease that would be a pulmonary disease. And in 2018, the WHO commissioned a study which came back in 2019 with the title, A World at Risk. And in between, we had SARS and we had Ebola, a number of these challenges. So I think the most poignant question asked during the course of this pandemic was that posed by President Trump when he asked, who could have known? It seems to me that everyone should have known. And so the tragedy is not just that we're experiencing this terrible burden of suffering and death and disruption to life, but that a portion of it, one can decide how great a portion and disagree about that, but certainly a substantial portion was unnecessary and could have been prevented. So it's the contrast between our preparedness. We were, in fact, in 2019, put at the top of the world's study of preparedness for a pandemic. And it turns out, because we have the CDC, we have some of the world's best scientists, the NIH, we have the world's wonderful therapeutic centers, but there were so many critical ways that we remained unprepared that actually we've done much worse than other countries. And there's that paradox, which is, I think, will haunt us for some time. How could this have happened? And how could it have been averted?
Yeah. Well, to switch gears, though, we'll end up coming back around to that. One of the things that we've seen from the start of the COVID outbreak is the way this pandemic has overlapped with the kind of longer systemic pandemic of racism. And the overlap sort of expressed visibly this summer, the spring and summer, in the vast and largely masked crowds protesting police violence, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. And then as the statistics emerged about the high percentages of cases, hospitalizations, fatalities among Black, Brown, and Indigenous populations. And these statistics highlighted a long history of discrimination in medical access and housing and employment and income. And sort of looking back over previous pandemics, how do you see these elements coming up over and over again? The discrimination and racism sort of intertwining, or economic inequalities intertwining, amplifying the course of a particular pandemic.
Well, I think that one wouldn't say that all diseases, all pandemics have had the same impact. I believe that every society creates pathways that particular types of pathogens can, if they're adapted to them, exploit to travel through our midst. And those are related to the kind of society and its stage of development. In this case, with regard to COVID-19, I would call it the first great pandemic of the era of globalization. And it's through pathways created by this intense, rapid connectivity, this intense growth of population, urbanization, devastation of the environment around us. And that means our relationship with other animals, in this case, bats, has become problematic, not through any ill intention on the part of the bats, but the way in which we have reached out and destroyed and altered their habitat. Also, the jet airplane has played a very important role, so that if we think there have been many comparisons between the Spanish influenza and this COVID-19, but the Spanish influenza occurred and was driven largely by total war and the mobilization and deployment of people for that reason, and not, in fact, there was not the first intercontinental air flight was long in the future at that time. And the connectivity of trade and commerce was all at a much lower threshold. It's taken many quantum leaps since then. So we live, I believe, in a profoundly different world. from the time of 1918 to 19. And we're facing a disease of a new era and of a different kind. I think that's critical to understand. And a feature of this disease is that it's unlike some diseases of the past, smallpox in the European era in Europe was a relatively, should we call it, equal opportunity disease that affected people of every social class, kings and nobles, artists, and the poor as well. All diseases, therefore, are not exploiting poverty in particular, but COVID-19 is a disease that's traveling through our midst on pathways that poverty, disadvantage, and pre-existing medical and environmental pathologies have made a great highway through our midst. And that seems to me to exist in a number of different ways. One is, as you say, that of race. And African Americans, Latinx people, and Native Americans have experienced levels of disease and death and suffering which are disproportionate, way disproportionate to their position in numbers demographically in the society. And that's not by chance, and it has nothing to do with the genetic endowments of different races. It has everything to do instead, well, first with environmental pollution. That, and if you look at the redlining of American cities, and then you put an environmental grid about the worst air conditions in modern America, what's extraordinary is that the two correlate very precisely. That is to say that people who live in the inner cities in America have much more pollution, much lower quality air. And we now know that air pollution and smog are one of the great drivers of mortality around the world and of a host of diseases. And so it's not by chance that a disease that particularly strikes people through the air that they breathe and is a pulmonary disease is particularly dangerous to people who have pre-existing pulmonary issues. And so that's a major liability, and that's something that people of color and Hispanic people in our country are experiencing to a devastating degree. It's also true that people of color and Hispanic people also suffer because of their jobs that prevent them from being able to take time off work, that put them in the front lines in hospitals or buses or transport or meatpacking plants. And to get to their jobs, they have to go on buses or subways or in carpooling. And those are all perilous situations because they don't have access to medical care. They can't afford to take time off work. Maybe they work in nursing homes and they work several jobs, another major factor of exposure to this airborne disease. And then their housing tends to be dense, it's often multi-generational, and to put them at risk from being so densely crowded together in conditions that often aren't that sanitary. So we see that this is, and these factors of bigotry, I would say, are not only simply race with regard to ethnic groups, but also to women. Not that they're more exposed to the disease, but if you look at some of the people who are most affected, say in the nursing professions, and administering care to elder people, caregivers. They are disproportionately affected in that environment. And one can also see a great deal of institutional bigotry towards the elderly, that is ageism, which is, and here I'd like to stress that this is one of the drivers of the pandemic, as well as one of the leading tragedies. In Canada, 80% of the people who died of COVID-19 were elderly people in nursing homes. In Spain, it was 63%. In the United Kingdom, it was about 50%. In this country, it's in the 42% or so. And in some states like Massachusetts, it's 66%. So here we have layers of ageism, sexism, that is to say, the elderly, it's women who live longer. They are the people disproportionately affected. They're also disproportionately the workforce, and many of them are immigrants or people of color. So we have a kind of layered vulnerability to this disease in which one weighs on another. And African Americans and Latinos have disproportionate numbers of pre-existing morbidities. And we now know that those create enormous vulnerability to this disease. Obesity seems to be one of the greatest drivers, but also diabetes, heart disease, and as I said before, pulmonary disease. So these are all conditions that have made this, and this is part of the reason that this disease, as returning to an earlier question you asked, will be enormously important in its impact on American society, because this disease has laid bare for all to see all of these inequalities, this lack of social justice in our society. And so I do believe it's likely to be transformative because I guess pandemic diseases, I've said at least somewhere before, are also like mirrors that we hold to ourselves. And I do believe that we're seeing who we actually are as a society. And some of the things that we're seeing, we wish we didn't, and are certainly not beautiful. And these enormous disparities of economic resources, access to care, housing, clean air to breathe, all of these are playing out in a dramatic way before our eyes.
Right. And adding that, especially I think maybe in this country, the sort of the insults and attacks against those of Asian descent, right? That we've seen it at many different levels. What weaving in there to this nexus. One of the crises that I see sort of on the horizon, or looming challenges that we have, will be the processing of the grief and the loss. You know, one of the things that certainly is true, pandemics are all so extremely different and have different impacts. Oh, that's my sign for the last question. But they disrupt the grief, the ways societies have developed to handle grief and loss. You know, the funerals, the memorial services, the memorials, all of these sorts of things that societies have developed to deal with the impacts and the loss. And how do you think? Do you have sort of from your studies of all of these pandemics any sort of ways that we might navigate through dealing with the backlog of grief, given how much has been postponed? I mean, not that people are not feeling grief, but there's going to be, without the funerals, without the memorial services, there's going to be a lot of sort of psychological work to do in the aftermath of this, when it at least fades, if not goes away.
Yes, the psychological professions are telling us a great deal about the fact that there will be a sort of trailing pandemic of mental illness. And this is seen already through extraordinary rises in the incidence of domestic violence, of drug and substance abuse of various kinds. And there are lots of the degrees of insomnia and depression are very, and cries for help. So one of the, I think there are many things to be said about that. One is that this cries out for our medical professions, there's not just one, but collectively to give much more attention, not just to physical health, but to mental health needs to be prioritized. And it needs to be part of post traumatic counseling and support that needs to be built much more extensively in our system. And we need to be aware that this is a major problem. It's not only a medical problem, though, only. I think there are lots of ways that are important in processing grief. And I imagine that the arts, music, painting, literature, have a role to play here. I believe that the teaching profession has an important role to play here in explaining what has happened to people. People desperately need a sense of context, a sense of hope, that why this happened, but that it can be transcended, and that there is a future, that it will end, and the future will be better, and that what they're experiencing is not just their experience alone, but it's shared, that we're all in the same boat, we're all in this together. And there's a great grieving that I say our country and the world as a whole need to go through as part of this. It's not just individual, but it's also a great collective loss. And I think we'll be dealing with that for some time. In our physicians will be dealing with it. Families will be doing it with it. Educators, artists, musicians, writers, historians, I think, are all part of how we process and understand what's happened to us.
Well, that seems like a perfect spot to segue into the second half of this event. So I would call on Dr. Wu. He is going to be leading the question and answer part of from the audience, and just a reminder to put those questions, listeners, in the Q&A, and thank you so much for answering all of these questions that I had the good fortune to be able to ask.
Thank you, and it was a great pleasure to have this conversation.
So, Dr. Wu.
Thank you, Professor Snowden, and thank you, Dr. Alka, for an enlightening discussion. I'm just going to, being that I'm the moderator, I'm going to take the first question for myself. But I want to go back to, and I encourage anyone who's all the participants in this discussion to go ahead and use that Q&A and pose their questions, and I will ask them as many as I can in the next 15 or 20 minutes. I'll take the first question and ask actually both of you for Dr. Alka and Dr. Snowden. And I go back to Dr. Alka's original premise about sort of a comparison between the impacts of war versus a pandemic. And I just wonder if the impacts that we see in terms of literature and arts and is lessened for a pandemic by the fact that there really just aren't any good hero stories to tell. It's sort of speaking from, I guess, like a Joseph Campbell kind of a point of view, like there are no myths to make up about a pathogen. We can certainly demonize it in some ways, but it's an invisible enemy. And so I wonder if you might comment, Dr. Alka and Dr. Stone, about the way that we tell stories about pandemics after they happen.
If I could just say something, a word first, and Elizabeth, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But just a first comment that as it comes immediately to mind when you say that is that I think I would challenge the view that there are no heroes here. I think that there are lots of heroes here. I think that many pandemics throw up heroes. I think Pasteur was a hero. I think that some of the doctors who dealt with the bubonic plague were heroes. I think that in Ebola, I think Doctors Without Borders were heroes. I think that the nurses who dealt with patients during the 1918-19 pandemic are heroes. And I think that the workers from Wuhan, the healthcare workers who treated patients without proper protective gear, without knowing what they were facing and without understanding the disease, they were all putting their lives on the line and working 16, 18 hours a day, day after day, in the most terrible, frightening conditions, and suffering post-traumatic stress as a result, not sleeping, needing psychological counseling, having depression, and sacrificing their mental as well as their physical well-being. I think those are heroes, and I'm really hoping that their stories will be told. That this will, and they also in many cases, the drivers of buses and transportation systems that kept the economy going in this period. There are so many stories to be told, and I'm hoping that that will be part of the future and that they will be recognized as having played as heroic a role as the soldiers in the First World War, who have been memorialized extensively, and they're heroes too, but these are other heroes of a different kind and much more, I think it's just as important to remember that, and recognizing them is part of our story and how we process these events and move forward as individuals and as a community. So that's where I wanted to start. And I'm very anxious. I know, Elizabeth, that you have a lot to say about this particular issue and the role of the arts in the Spanish influenza. So let me yield by all means to you.
Oh, no, I will be very quick. I do think and I find your comments on heroism really moving. I think that with the Spanish, with the 1918 pandemic and the war, there were multiple factors that meant that the war just overshadowed the pandemic in the historical memory, though people really did remember it for years. Some of it was, I think, the invisibility of the threat. I saw an image the other day of whether you would go out if COVID was huge, right? These huge sort of COVID balls bouncing along the streets of New York. And it's just like, no, you would not go out. That there's something about the invisibility of the threat. In World War I, there was something about the sacrificial, even if you disagreed with the war, you could frame those deaths as sacrificial, whereas a flu death, this common, seemingly, I mean, it was a very different strain, but this seemingly common illness, people couldn't take that in, right? They did not want to think about a death that had so little, that you could not frame as sacrificial, right? It was extremely difficult to deal with grief of that sort of magnitude. And then I think people, to get back to a point Dr. Snowden made about the length of time, 4.5 years of war, everybody was defining themselves around the war. They knew their characters, they knew their role, they knew the plot, they knew how it ended, they knew all of these things. And the pandemic came in with this ferocity, right? It extended over 2 years, but it was mainly these 4 months. And I think people just, it was very hard to change the paradigm by which they saw it. And it wasn't the stories that they were used to telling, right? The stories of the war and heroism, and that they knew those stories. And these stories, even though very much these were heroic doctors who were and nurses, there was still this sense that this wasn't the story that people wanted to hear, or that, and people had so little control over the flu. I think sometimes we evaluate non-human threats differently than human threats, though you could certainly argue that pandemics are very much human threats, but they have a different quality.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'd like to pose a question that came in before the discussion started, and for both of you, ideas on how to engage people in fighting a pandemic. Throughout history, are there examples of actions or persuasive messages that have worked to mobilize a large population of people to fight disease?
If I could, I would like to draw on my own experience, which is to say that I've lived in 2 environments during COVID-19. One was throughout the spring, I was in Italy and experienced their messaging. And since then, I've been reading about and experiencing what has happened in America. And what I think there's a profound difference in the messaging, which makes a has profound impact on the reactions of the population. The Italian government instituted a total lockdown in the spring, and it was more extensive and severe than anything that's happened in this country, and the fines and arrests to which you could be subject were much more punitive, and you couldn't go out at all. And I myself was inside without ever going out for some 8 weeks or so. And then I got the disease itself. And so that was, extended my period indoors, a mild case, I'm happy to say. But what was so interesting was that the Prime Minister came on television and on radio, and then was all media. And he explained that there was no vaccine, there was no cure, this was a terrible threat, but that there were just a few limited tools that were available to combat this danger, and that the welfare of individuals, of their families, their cities and communities, and of Italy as a whole, it was, if you like, a patriotic call to respond to this, and the parties all supported it. The public health personnel and physicians supported this program. So there was one voice, and it was extraordinary. I remember myself, you were allowed to go out initially just to a pharmacy or to a food store within a limited range of your home, and you had to have a printed document in which you stated where you were going or why, and there were police about, and if they stopped you and asked to see your document and you were in some place that wasn't consistent with what you said, then you were subject to a very hefty fine. In any case, the lines outside the supermarket, socially distanced, masked, and so on, of course, it's interesting to listen to what people said. And they talked about, oh, maybe this is like World War II. Maybe this is how people in London felt during the Blitz, that we're all in this together and we need to help each other. And then there was a very moving description of the local newspaper, Il Messaggero in Rome, which said this was the first time in 3,000 years of the history of Rome that the population had ever been obedient. Now, I contrast that with what I've experienced here, which is a president, his advisors, different views, the 50 states, all different. Within them, the counties different, the school boards different. I would say it rather, we have a totally fragmented response, which people are confused. This is part, I believe, of the psychological trauma of this disease. People don't know what to think, don't know how to help themselves, don't understand what's going on. And we've had a terrible result from this. And I believe, to make a sort of an analogy, I would say that the Italian, and I don't want to make a mythology of Italy, Italy was not a perfect response, but its messaging was very powerful and clear. That's the difference I want to say. And what it was rather as if you had a symphony orchestra with a single conductor and all the players with one score. In the United States, what we have instead is all of the players of the orchestra, each playing his or her own individual score, and there is no conductor. And so the result is cacophony and chaos. And I think that's what we're living through. And I think that's part of the reason that this is such a traumatic experience in our country.
That's a wonderful analogy. Dr. Alka, do you have something to add to this?
I do think that sort of telling stories of, or getting back to an ethos of, or maybe not back, but fostering an ethos of the public good, right? This idea of the public good, and giving people a reason why it is that they are, that masks need to be worn, right? And that these things, I think that we were a little better at the beginning in terms of sort of telling stories about why it is that these sort of steps were so important. And then I think, people got tired of it, and it kind of unraveled. But I think I would also love to see a much more powerful marketing of masks, giving people reasons for them, changing the way we construct, what they mean. It may be too late. But telling better stories, right, about that. And then I would only add that for the long term kind of galvanization of people. I mean, I always turn back to literature as a way of, and art more generally, as a way of digesting what it is that has happened, and as a way of imagining how we might do something differently in the future. But that's a more long-term solution.
So just I'll add my 2 cents here. And what I'm hearing from Dr. Snowden is that leadership counts, right? That messaging counts. And as a Taiwanese native and an immigrant to this country, I've watched the response here versus in Taiwan, one of the few real success stories of this pandemic. And Dr. Snowden is exactly right that leadership counts. When everybody speaks with the same voice in the government about how to approach this thing. And history counts, because Taiwan is a country that lived through the original SARS pandemic epidemic in the early 2000s, and they took that experience and learned from it, and then took messaging to a national level that allowed them to act with one intent and talk with one voice. And that really made quite a difference in terms of the outcomes that you see there versus here. So I want to turn to a question that has come in from Joanna Drell. She's a historian of medieval southern Italy, and she asks, what connections to or similarities to the Black Death and the bubonic plague have you seen, or are you seeing with COVID? And moving ahead 600 plus years from the Black Death, does COVID serve as a mirror? And what mirror do you see COVID showing to Italy, especially southern Italy?
Right. Well, the first part of the very complicated question, the first part has to do with how we see similarities between the Black Death and COVID-19. And there I would say that although there are also extraordinary differences, let us thank heavens, between the Black Death and COVID-19, not least of which is we see the speed with which science is developing new tools to deal with it. That's, I think that's very important. But though there are similarities, I think when the Black Death struck Sicily and then moved up the Italian peninsula, Florence and Venice, and remained for the physicians of 15th century Florence had no idea of what was striking them, what it came from, how long it would last. I think that was initially, we've come a long way and learned a lot at extraordinarily rapid speed with COVID-19, but initially the doctors and the public were in the same position as the physicians in Florence had been in the 15th century of dealing with an unknown lethal killer disease with possibly excruciating symptoms. And then when you see what people did in various countries around the world, they use a public health. One of the silver linings of the horrible experience of the bubonic plague was the development of public health as a series of practices to protect communities. And so we see already developed in Venice and Florence were precursors, and then it spread throughout Western Europe, where a lot of, if someone from the 15th century suddenly took a time machine and came to us today, they would recognize a lot of the features. They would recognize there was PPE that doctors wore. They had a mask and they had a costume that was waxed. There was even a medical theory for the waxing. The doctors also had a long rod, and the rod was, we would call it social distancing, to be sure that people kept at a certain distance. There were also what were called lazzaretti or plague hospitals. And we've had whole hospitals devoted by force, that is to say, the wards were cleared of all other cases and they became COVID hospitals. And that's a feature that was similar. We see extraordinary powers, that is to say, that in the Renaissance, there were health magistrates set up with extraordinary power, legislative, administrative, to tax, to set up hospitals, to recruit medical personnel. And these become, in our day, these were the boards of health that we have today. And so there were many public health principles, and around Wuhan, we see the construction of something else done during the time of the Black Death, which is a sanitary cordon of closing off all the movement in and out of a geographical area of whatever size. Quarantine and isolation were practiced. Indeed, the word quarantine comes from the 40, which is the period that people were put into isolation to be sure that they were harmless. So in those ways, there's similarities in the public health practices. One can also say that the bubonic plague transformed the economy of the world. And a sort of lining, a silver lining in a horrible it's the bubonic plague is the worst scenario of a disease that it's held up as the worst scenario. So I don't want to say that it was good in any way, but there are, even in the worst experiences, some silver linings. And one of these, although it was posthumous, was that so many people died, half the population of Europe perhaps, that it allowed workers and the rise of a middle class, workers to enter the guilds, to have higher wages, to eat meat, to all and new entrepreneurial marketing practices, and the slow development of those preconditions that were to lead to industrial development. So one can say the rise then of a new class and the end of a feudal society and the coming of what we know as a capitalist economy. The preconditions for that were in part laid by the bubonic plague, and another precondition, something also that can be negative, but is mostly part of our society, our survival apparatus, and that is centralization of state power. That Thomas Hobbes and his social contract, the Leviathan, he imagined a social contract with, that is to say, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And so we need state authority to save us, to protect our lives, to make them not short and brutal. And I think we say that now public health is an instrument of the state to achieve those purposes. And so we're all dependent on that, or we couldn't survive. And I think that the rise of the state, taxation, administration, record keeping, all of that emerged with the bubonic plague and have been with us since, and other diseases have contributed along the way afterwards. So that's a feature, and I believe that this is going to be a transformative influence in our economy and in our social relationships and in our urban life. Not all of the effects will be good, but some of them will be positively transformative if we are willing to put our heads together and reimagine what a safer world could be like, and to deal with the conditions that brought us to this particular position. With regard to the part of the question that had to do with COVID-19 in the south of Italy, that's an extremely interesting question that needs a lot more work done, because the overall picture is rather a different one, that the disease is a disease of globalization. And it was Northern Italy, Lombardy in particular, that was, as soon as it broke out in Wuhan in China, Lombardy had a target on its back. And there was a reason for that. And that is, I believe it was 2016, Xi Jinping of China and the president of Italy, Mattarella, met and signed a great bilateral agreement. And what China wanted was access to Italian technology and equipment and to how to build a green economy. What the Italians wanted was access to this burgeoning, almost infinite Chinese market. And so you had Italians having fairs in various Chinese cities. You have international flights, 6 airlines take people, or took people, I won't say at this moment, but between a year ago, took people from Milan and Rome to Shanghai, Beijing, and 4 other cities in China. There was the idea that Italy, Milan would attract millions of Chinese tourists a year. Companies signed bilateral agreements. Students came to learn Italian law from China, or the vice versa, and to learn Italian techniques and marketing and managerial practices. There is in Milan a Chinatown of 25,000 people, and something like 3 million tourists a year between about 2018, 2017, 2019, and 2020 was going to be the great year of Chinese-Italian tourism. This, I'm afraid, didn't happen, but this was the vision and the plan. And that's why also the fact that the north of Italy was a perfect place its huge demography, its density of population, and its air pollution, which I have stressed before and was very important in the vulnerability of the North. So, and then its age. It had the second oldest population in the world, and we know that this is a disease that preferentially strikes the elderly. So it's a disease for which the north of Italy was particularly adapted. And that's interesting because there are many other diseases, malaria, or many others for which the south of Italy was much more vulnerable. But this didn't happen to be one of them.
So we're approaching the end of our time here, and I maybe want to just finish on a good note. And you mentioned that all of these events have silver linings. So if you, Professor Snowden and Professor Alka, could maybe wrap up with perhaps giving us some sense of what a sense of hope might look like for our current pandemic, given from a historical perspective and perhaps from a literature and arts perspective.
I think there are lots of grounds for hope and optimism. One is the impetus this has given to the development of medical science. And this is going to be a record-shattering brevity with which vaccines, in fact, more than one will be developed. It usually takes the best part of a decade. The most rapid development in the past is 4 years. And here, this has been with us for less than a year, and we're about to have, for emergency use, the approval from the FDA of a number of vaccine candidates. And so that's, I think, very optimistic and important. The international exchange of information, the genetic code of this was developed right away, a matter of weeks, and shared throughout the world. That scientific knowledge, they have preprints online. And so that's been a whole different way in which knowledge and information is shared almost immediately throughout the world scientific community. That's very hopeful. I would say there are many others. One is that, give an example, European cities, Milan as an example, are thinking of how to reimagine themselves in ways that after this disease, they will be healthier to live in and more resistant to diseases of this kind. When the city is passed on to our children and grandchildren, there will be less vulnerability. There'll be many larger spaces where people can go shopping, but practice social distancing. That cultural facilities and recreational facilities will be reimagined and rethought. Work experience will also be transformed, and not all of that in negative ways. The way buildings are built, their architecture, their ventilation, the way air circulates in them to make them safer. There are a lot of things that are in the works that will make our world safer and much safer to live in the future. And I think people need to put their heads together to make this a time of creativity and imagining a future that can be better. I would argue we can't go back to the past. This is an experience that is, as one historian movingly said, a portal to a new society and a new era. And we can't go back. That got us to the mess we're in now. We want something better and something more sustainable, something that children and grandchildren, and I don't see that as gloomy. I can sign up for that in a heartbeat.
Well, what a great way to finish this discussion. I'll turn it over to Dr. Alka to wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, no, so thank you. Thank you so much. to Dr. Snowden, to Dr. Wu, to Dean Rankin, and thanks to all of the audience who joined today and asked great questions. Please remember to check out the School of Arts and Science website for further information and to stay up to date on what's coming next in this webinar series. And we hope to see you soon. Another thank you to Dr. Snowden for sharing his great expertise on pandemics. And to everyone out there, please stay safe and healthy, and best wishes for a wonderful break.
And thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's been very, very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you so much.